Vampires are possibly the most ubiquitous monster of all time. As Nina Airbach declared in her book, Our Vampires Ourselves, every age invents the vampire it needs. The idea of a vampire has existed for centuries, changing and molding to the needs and circumstances of each era. And yet, I don't know that we really understand how timeless the idea of a vampire is. In 1100, Kundash Kalman, the king of Hungary at the time, famously declared, A strigakról, varázs erővel bíró vámpírszerű lények, pedig, mivel ilyenek nincsenek, semmiféle vizsgálat ne tartassék. This in English translates to, and as for the strigas, since there are none, no inquiry shall be held. A striga was a blood-sucking creature similar to our modern concept of vampires. Not exactly the same, but it's 1,000 years ago. So this is a written decree dating back almost 1,000 years that mentions vampires. If we are willing to simplify the concept of a vampire, there are traditions that go back even further. Greek and Roman tradition gives account of a lamia, which was a half-woman, half-snake creature that preyed on children and travelers and sucked their blood. Further back still, traditions in circa 4000 BCE Egypt believed in spirits that persisted after death, relying on blood for their primary sustenance. These traditions give precedent for a belief in monsters that feast on human blood, just as our modern vampires do. But why vampires? Among countless possible objects of terror, including lamia, gorgons, demons, and others, why is the idea of a vampire so persistent? I would argue that it is because vampires in every age have served as an etiology for the time. Now, what is an etiology? An etiology is a story that explains some reason for why things are the way they are. One good example is the tale of Arachne in Greek mythology. Arachne, the daughter of a cloth tradesman, was known for her skill in spinning threads. Prideful in her talent, she challenged Athena, goddess of wisdom and crafts, to a tapestry making contest. Athena's tapestry showed the splendor and power of the gods, depicting their many heroic acts. Arachne's, however, showed the gods abusing their power for their own gain. While offensive, Arachne's tapestry was undoubtedly better. Furious that she had been bested, Athena shrieked at Arachne, a scream which transfigured her into the first spider. Ancient Greeks believed that all spiders descended from Arachne. That was how they existed in the first place. In fact, our English word arachnid etymologically shows this connection. The arachn base it refers to Arachne, and the id suffix denotes that which looks like. So an arachnid is literally that which looks like Arachne. And while the story was meant to be believed, an explanation for why such unique creatures as spiders exist, it also contains a message meant to subvert the hubris of man, lest their pride turn them into something dreadful. So does the etymology of the word vampire tell us anything about their origins? Unfortunately, nothing conclusive, as experts actually disagree on the makeup of the word. While some experts believe that the word is Hungarian, as we might expect considering Dracula comes from Transylvania, many others do not subscribe to that school of thought, believing instead that the word is Turkish, Hebrew, or even Greek. Thus, our best guess at understanding what a vampire represents etiologically is by reading texts about vampires and drawing our own conclusions. I would like to focus on two themes I found prevalent in these texts: sickness and foreignness. So first let's talk about sickness. It would not be hyperbole to say that vampires were born in disease. After the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1346, a pandemic broke out that would end up killing a third of the population of Europe. Amidst the continuous and seemingly inevitable death of friends, neighbors, and family, people felt powerless as to their fates and to the fates of those around them. Searching for a solution, they found scapegoats in many groups of people, including Jews, foreigners, travelers, and even lepers. However, when it was found that these people also died from the Black Death and the ensuing pandemic, people turned their suspicions away from them and away from live people and onto the dead. They began opening graves and found that in many cases the bodies were as if they had just barely died and had fresh blood on their mouths. Believing these people were spreading the disease and rising in the night and drinking blood to elongate their lives, they assumed them to be vampires and began blaming them as the reason for the spread of the plague. One such notable case, happened in Kishilova, a small town in Serbia. In 1725, the height of vampire hysteria in the area, a peasant by the name of Peter Plogojevich got sick, died, and was buried. However, over the next week, 9 others died, each suffering from maladies of less than 24 hours, which, as a note, is quite in line for a severe variant of the bubonic plague. What's more, each of these individuals claimed before their deaths that Peter had visited and attacked them during the night. Hoping to bring this death to an end, the villagers exhumed Peter's body, only to find that his hair and nails had grown, which is uncharacteristic of a corpse, and that there was blood in his mouth. The villagers drove a stake through his heart and burned the corpse, a method we nowadays commonly associate with the killing of a vampire. So they thought he was a vampire. But beyond historical precedent, the connection between vampires and sickness finds ample precedent in vampire texts. For example, in Dracula, Lucy Westenra is a perfectly healthy young girl in Britain who falls very ill suddenly. Jack Seward, a doctor and one of her suitors, should know how to help her. But when he goes to diagnose her, he claims, quote, "In my opinion, there is not any functional disturbance or any malady that I know of. At the same time, I am not by any means satisfied with her appearance. She is woefully different from what she was when I saw her last." Lucy dies not long after this exchange. Why would an otherwise healthy person suddenly get sick and die? In an era of British history that prides itself on its knowledge and empiricism, it has no answer. The vampire thus serves as an explanation for why such a thing might happen. We observe similar cases in Carmilla. As soon as Carmilla moves in with Laura and her father, healthy people in the surrounding areas begin dying. In one case, Laura recalls, quote, "The swineherd's young wife died only a week ago, and she thought something seized her by the throat as she lay in her bed and nearly strangled her. Papa says such horrible fancies do accompany some forms of fever. She was quite well the day before. She sank afterwards and died before a week." It is hard to accept the sudden death of a family or community member who had no previous signs that indicated their health was declining. Even harder still, when the doctors have no idea what is going on. It leaves a hole in one's life and brings about a world that was never hoped for. It is in these cases that the vampire serves as an etiology and a scapegoat. Now, let's change gears. Let's talk about foreignness. Regardless of legend, vampires are not humans, and in most stories, they are not treated as humans, even though we have to acknowledge vampires are it's kind of a communicable sickness in some senses, right? So a vampire in a lot of stories can turn a human into a vampire, but vampires and humans are not the same. In Dracula, we see the Count characterized as dangerous, threatening to destroy British society. In this way, Dracula serves as an explanation for the fear of reverse colonization, which is a term I am borrowing from Stephen D. Arata's essay, The Occidental Tourist. Dracula, as most depictions have it, originates from Eastern Europe. Notably, to readers in 1897, this region was first and foremost a site not of superstition and Gothic romance, which is how we, in a lot of ways, perceive it today, but of political turbulence and of racial strife. In fact, Bram Stoker originally planned to have Castle Dracula in Styria, which is in Austria, which would pay homage to Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, a vampire text that predates Dracula by 25 years. But he chose instead to relocate it to Transylvania, thinking the character of Dracula would resonate more with readers if his background was in an area that was characterized by conquest. Let us now consider Dracula in terms of his identity as a Transylvanian man, tracing his ancestry back to the Seke people who have undergone conquering and been conquered. Taking that perspective, it doesn't take much to read past Jonathan Harker's quote. This was the being I was helping to transfer to London, where perhaps for centuries to come he might, amongst its teeming millions, satiate his lust for blood and create a new and ever-widening circle of semi-demons to batten on the helpless. The danger that Jonathan here refers to is a literal deracination we see. We see that vampires turn into humans and suddenly they become vampires. And he thought that was dangerous. But we see this. As Lucy is bitten, who we've talked about, she turns more and more into a vampire until eventually the upper-class British lady she once was is gone. Vampire Lucy even has her hair color changed from blonde to brown to better fit her new race. No longer British, but rather vampire, having joined the ranks of Dracula. This deracination is not without precedent. We read of Romanian men and women that, quote, "The Hungarian woman who weds a Romanian husband will necessarily adopt the dress and manners of his people, and her children will be as good Romanians as though they had no drop of Magyar blood in their veins. While the Magyar, who takes a Romanian girl for his wife, will not only fail to convert her to his ideas, but himself, subdued by her influence, will imperceptibly begin to lose his nationality. This is a fact well known and much lamented by the Hungarians themselves, who live in anticipated apprehension of seeing their people ultimately dissolving into Romanians. It is easy to see why someone might not want foreigners to come into their country when those foreigners are vampires that literally feast on the innocent. And it is easy to paint foreigners as vampires." In some ways, Fledgling by Octavia Butler contains similar imagery surrounding the vampires, who the vampires are, or Ina as they're called in the book. Brooke, a symbiont that Shori adopts, says regarding the Ina's past that, quote, "They usually looked like foreigners, and when times got bad, they were treated like foreigners, suspected, disliked, driven out, or killed." This foreigner narrative thus applies to the vampires in this story as it does in Dracula as well. However, Fledgling departs from the established progression of this narrative. This is partially because while the dynamic between humans and vampires is interesting, this story spends much more of its time on the narrative between the society of vampires and our vampire protagonist Shori, a 53-year-old Ina that has the appearance of an 11-year-old black girl. In this context, Shori is the foreigner, having lost all memory of her now deceased Ina family and having dark skin that phenotypically distinguishes herself from all other Ina. Some of the Ina even fear Shori. They feel that her blackness and ability to stay awake during the day constitute danger to Ina society at large. Russell Silk, a member of the Ina family that repeatedly tries to kill Shori, says, "We are not them, nor should we try to be them, ever, not for any reason, not even to gain the day." So he's referring to Shori and how she is able to somewhat stay awake during the day and how that is dangerous. So he's referring to Shori as a danger to Ina society. In this way, while many of the characters in this tale are in fact vampires, I mean the whole of Ina society is vampires. However, Shori is more truly a vampire in the symbolic sense. She represents a foreign danger to preconceived notions of societal stability. This antagonization that Shori faces does not limit itself to perceived danger. It also extends to a more derogatory, dehumanizing form. Milo Silk, the patriarch and father of the aforementioned Silk family, says to Shori that, quote, "You're not Ina, you're not. You have no more business at this council than would a clever dog." So ironically, here's kind of this interesting irony. The Silk family and some of these Ina, they repeatedly characterize and view Shori as not a vampire. They paint her as the foreigner. Yet what have we kind of been talking about? We've been talking about how the vampire is the foreigner, right? And so in the exact act of them declaring that she's not a vampire and that she's not welcome in the society is precisely the reason that she becomes the symbolic vampire of this narrative, the foreigner who's trying to enter the society. However, there's contrast between this and Dracula. In contrast to Dracula, when reading Fledgling, we do not perceive our vampire Shori to be dangerous, but we instead see the bigotry, hate, and racism of the society that she exists in. In understanding this difference, cultural context is very relevant. Dracula was written for a British audience, which, amidst the weakening of British hegemony in the late 19th century, was afraid of the possibility of foreign invasion. Fledgling, on the other hand, was written from the perspective of modern Black Americans, who coexist with white Americans, but in many ways have been dehumanized and barred from contributing to society. Regardless of story, however, the title and meaning of the vampire remains the same: a foreign entity that threatens change. The story of the vampire continues to be widespread. From Twilight to Castlevania, What We Do in the Shadows to Magic the Gathering, millions of people continue to consume movies and literature about vampires. And while our vampires change, the more they change, the more they stay the same. Symbols of oft unwanted change, whether it be the death of a loved one by sickness, or a more institutional foreigner coming in and disrupting the ideas of notions of society. It's this idea of change that's uncomfortable. So, when something unfortunate happens that drastically changes the circumstances of your life, take solace in knowing that you have historical and literary precedent to blame a vampire.